Story 1. The Watcher in the Shadows. It was the fall of 2006, and I was looking forward to a peaceful weekend alone at my family's farmhouse. Nestled deep in the countryside, miles away from the nearest town, the farmhouse had always been a place of solace for me. My parents were away for the weekend, and the idea of spending time in the quiet, isolated house seemed perfect. The house stood on a vast piece of land, surrounded by thick woods that stretched for miles. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and the nearest road was a long, winding path through the fields. It was the kind of place where you could disappear and not be found for days, a fact that, at the time, I found comforting. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. The drive up had been peaceful, the leaves on the trees already starting to change color, painting the landscape in hues of red and gold. The air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of earth and pine that I had come to associate with the farmhouse. I parked the car in the gravel driveway, the crunch of the stones under my tires the only sound in the otherwise silent countryside. The house loomed ahead, its white paint weathered and chipped, the windows dark and lifeless. It had been months since I last visited, and yet it felt like I had never left. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and headed up the front steps, the wood creaking under my weight. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open with a familiar groan. Inside, the air was still and musty, the scent of aged wood and dust filling my lungs as I stepped into the hallway. The house was just as I remembered it, old, but comforting in its familiarity. The worn furniture, the family photos lining the walls, the grandfather clock in the corner of the living room, all reminders of the countless summers I had spent here as a child. I dropped my bag by the foot of the stairs and made my way into the kitchen. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow through the windows. I opened the fridge and found it mostly empty, save for a few leftover groceries from my last visit. I made a mental note to drive into town the next day to restock, but for now I settled on making a simple dinner. The silence of the house was comforting at first, the only sounds the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards as I moved about. It wasn't until later that night that the silence would take on a more sinister tone. After dinner, I decided to relax in the living room. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows across the walls. The warmth of the fire was soothing, and I soon found myself lost in the pages of a book I had brought with me. The night outside was pitch black, the woods and fields swallowed by the darkness. There were no streetlights out here, no distant glow from the town, just an endless void of blackness beyond the windows. It was the kind of darkness that felt oppressive, as though it could seep into the house if you left the curtains open too long. It was around p.m. when I first heard it. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible over the crackling of the fire. A soft, rhythmic sound that I couldn't quite place. I paused, listening carefully, but the sound faded, and I dismissed it as the house settling or perhaps the wind outside. I went back to my book, but a few minutes later, the sound came again, this time, louder and more distinct. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving around the house, as though someone were walking in circles just outside the walls. My heart skipped a beat. I set the book down and stood up, straining to hear. The footsteps continued, crunching through the gravel in the driveway before stopping near the back door. My mind raced. Who could be out here? The farmhouse was miles from the nearest town, and no one knew I was staying here this weekend. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just an animal, a deer maybe, or a stray dog. But the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate for that. They belonged to a person. I hurried to the back door, checking the lock. It was secure, just as I had left it. I moved through the house, checking every window, every door, making sure everything was locked tight. But the sense of unease didn't leave me. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I returned to the living room, my heart still racing. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the isolation. I tried to go back to reading, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept wandering back to the footsteps, the sound of someone or something moving just outside the house. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at me through the glass. And then the knock came. It was soft at first, barely more than a tap, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I froze, listening as the knock came again, louder this time. Someone was at the front door. I stood up slowly, my hands trembling as I moved toward the hallway. The knock came again, steady and rhythmic, like the person on the other side wasn't in any hurry. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My mind raced. Should I answer it? Should I pretend I wasn't home? I hadn't seen anyone approach the house, and the thought of someone standing on the porch in the darkness sent a wave of terror through me. I took a deep breath and slowly reached for the peephole. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing on the porch was a man, but he wasn't like any man I had ever seen before. His face was covered by a crude handmade mask, something that looked like it had been stitched together from old rags and leather. His clothes were tattered and worn, and his body was unnaturally still. He just stood there, staring at the door, as though he knew I was watching him. I stumbled back from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. My phone was upstairs, and even if I had it with me, there was no cell service out here. I was completely alone. The man knocked again, louder this time, more insistent. I backed away, my mind racing. I couldn't stay in the house, but I couldn't go outside either, not with him standing there. I needed to hide, to find somewhere safe until he left. My eyes darted around the room, looking for a place to go. The basement. There was an old cellar door in the kitchen that led down to the basement. It hadn't been used in years, but it was my only option. I moved quickly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The man knocked again, the sound echoing through the silent house. I reached the kitchen and pulled open the cellar door, the old wood groaning in protest. The basement was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and descended the stairs, my heart racing with every step. The basement was cold and damp, the stone walls slick with moisture. I hadn't been down here in years, and the sight of the old furniture and boxes covered in dust felt like stepping into a forgotten world. I crouched behind an old workbench, my flashlight flickering in the darkness. I tried to calm my breathing, listening for any sound from upstairs. For a few moments, everything was silent. And then I heard it. The front door creaked open. I clamped my hand over my mouth, trying to stifle the gasp that escaped my lips. He was inside the house. I could hear his footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving through the hallway. He was searching for me. My hands shook as I turned off the flashlight, plunging the basement into complete darkness. The only sound was my own breathing, shallow and panicked as I waited for him to find me. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear the creak of the floorboards above me as he moved through the house, his pace unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fought the urge to run. I knew that if I moved, if I made even the slightest noise, he would hear me. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then the sound of footsteps descending the basement stairs. I bit down on my lip, my body trembling with fear. He was coming for me. I could hear each step, slow and deliberate, as he made his way down into the basement. The air was thick with tension, and I felt like I was suffocating in the darkness. I closed my eyes, praying he wouldn't find me. But I knew that hiding wouldn't be enough. He was methodical, and he was getting closer. The footsteps continued down the basement stairs, each one slow and deliberate, as though the intruder knew exactly what he was doing, stretching out the suspense, letting me drown in my own fear. My grip on the flashlight tightened, though I had turned it off. I was crouched behind the old workbench, my back pressed against the cold, damp wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and I had to force myself to breathe quietly, to not give away my hiding spot. I couldn't see him, but I could hear him. His steps were cautious, deliberate, as if he was scanning the room, listening for any sign of life. My pulse pounded in my ears, louder than I had ever heard it before. I felt the sweat on my palms, the cold creeping into my bones. The basement, which had always seemed like a safe, forgotten place, now felt like a tomb, and I was the prey. As I crouched there in the dark, my mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why had he come to the house? What did he want? And most importantly, how had he gotten inside? I had locked the doors, checked the windows. There was no sign of forced entry. Yet, somehow, he was here, inside my home, searching for me. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear the faint creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet as he moved deeper into the basement. My eyes, though useless in the pitch black, darted around, trying to find a way out, a way to escape. But there was only one set of stairs, and he was on them. If I moved, if I so much as shifted, he would hear me. I was trapped. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped again. The silence that followed was unbearable. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The basement was so quiet, I could hear the faint sound of the wind outside, whistling through the cracks in the old foundation. But I couldn't hear him, and then a voice, low, raspy, and dripping with menace, cut through the silence like a knife. I know you're down here. My blood turned to ice. The voice was calm, steady, almost casual. It was as if he were talking to an old friend, someone he had known for years. But there was an edge to it, something dark and twisted lurking beneath the surface. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who enjoyed watching others squirm. I can hear you breathing, he continued, his footsteps resuming as he moved further into the room. You're not very good at hiding, are you? I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to stay still. My legs were cramping from being crouched in the same position for so long, but I didn't dare move. Not an inch. The only thing separating me from this intruder was the workbench and a thin veil of darkness. He couldn't see me, but that didn't mean he wouldn't find me. I'm not going to hurt you, the voice said, though I knew it was a lie. I just want to talk. The footsteps stopped again, and I heard the faint scraping of something metallic on the concrete floor. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what it was, but the sound sent a chill down my spine. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, to get out of that basement, but I was frozen in place. I've been watching you, you know, the voice continued, casual, as if we were having a normal conversation. For a while now. You've been coming to this house alone for years. No one ever comes with you. You're always by yourself. I like that. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the words, but they seeped into my mind like poison. He had been watching me. For how long? Weeks? Months? Years? The thought of this man lurking in the shadows, observing my every move, sent a wave of nausea through me. How many times had I been here, blissfully unaware that someone was out there, waiting for the right moment? "I knew you'd be here this weekend," he said, his tone conversational, as though we were old friends catching up after a long time apart. "That's why I came." The scraping sound grew louder, closer. My muscles tensed, every nerve in my body screaming for me to move, to do something. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, trapped in my own nightmare. "Are you afraid?" The voice asked mockingly. "You should be." And then the sound stopped. The scraping, the footsteps had all ceased, leaving nothing but an unbearable silence. I held my breath, waiting, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. But the basement remained still. For a moment, I dared to hope that he had left, that somehow he had decided to give up and go. Maybe he had gotten bored, or maybe he had found someone else to torment. But deep down, I knew better. He was still there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. My legs were cramping, my body aching from being crouched behind the workbench for so long. I couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, I would have to move. But the moment I tried to shift my weight, there was a sudden, deafening crash. I flinched, my eyes snapping open as the sound of metal hitting concrete echoed through the basement. My heart raced, and I forced myself to stay still, listening. The intruder had knocked something over, and from the sound of it, he was right behind me. My pulse quickened as I realized how close he was. Just a few feet away. If I moved, if I made even the slightest sound, he would find me. I was trapped. For a moment, everything was silent again. And then the voice returned, softer this time, almost a whisper. "I can smell your fear." I bit down on my lip, hard enough to draw blood, trying to suppress the scream that threatened to escape. My entire body trembled with fear, my muscles tense and aching. I could feel him now, his presence looming in the darkness, just out of sight, and then, in one swift motion, he was gone. The sound of footsteps ascending the stairs echoed through the basement, each one more distant than the last. I didn't dare move, not until I heard the creak of the basement door opening, followed by the soft click of it closing. My body relaxed slightly, though the terror still gripped me like a vice. He had left, or at least I thought he had. I stayed crouched behind the workbench for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening for any sign that he might return. But the house remained silent. Finally, when I was sure he was gone, I allowed myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. I turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was just as it had been when I entered, dusty, filled with old furniture and forgotten memories. But something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, a lingering sense of dread that clung to the walls like mold. I moved cautiously toward the stairs, the flashlight flickering as I ascended. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, and by the time I reached the top, my breath was visible in the faint light. I paused at the basement door, listening for any sound from the house beyond. Nothing. I opened the door slowly, peeking out into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire in the living room. I stepped out into the hallway, my heart still racing, and closed the basement door behind me. My body was still trembling, my hands shaking as I clutched the flashlight. I needed to leave. I moved quickly through the house, gathering my things as quietly as possible. The man was gone, but I didn't know for how long. I didn't want to stick around to find out. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and made my way to the front door. But when I reached the door, my blood ran cold. The lock was broken. The door had been forced open. The wood splintered where the intruder had pried it apart. My hands shook as I touched the broken lock, my mind racing. How had I not heard it? How had he gotten in without me noticing? And then I realized something even more terrifying. He hadn't left. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. The footsteps, the door closing it had all been a trick, a way to lure me out of my hiding spot. He was still in the house. I could feel it. I turned slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping across the dark hallway. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I listened for any sound, any sign of movement, and then, from the shadows at the end of the hallway, he stepped forward, the masked man. He stood there, his crude handmade mask illuminated by the faint light of the flashlight. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching me, his head slightly tilted to one side. My heart pounded in my chest, and I backed away slowly, my mind screaming for me to run. But my legs felt like they were made of lead. I was frozen in place, trapped in the gaze of the man who had been watching me for so long. He took a step forward, and I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment I thought it was over, but then I heard him speak again. "You can't hide forever." And with those words I ran. I didn't know where I was running to. I only knew that I needed to get as far away from him as possible. My feet pounded against the wooden floor as I sprinted down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house, which had always felt like a sanctuary, was now a maze of terror. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the darkness pressed down, making it hard to see where I was going. I burst into the kitchen, the flashlight forgotten somewhere in the hallway. My hands fumbled for the back door, but when I reached for the handle, my heart sank. The door wouldn't budge. It was stuck or locked from the outside. Panic surged through me. I yanked on the handle with all my strength, but it refused to move. My thoughts raced. I couldn't go back the way I came. The masked man was somewhere in the house, waiting for me. The only other option was the basement. My stomach churned at the thought of returning to that dark, suffocating space, but I had no choice. I couldn't stay here. I spun around, racing back toward the basement stairs. As I reached the top of the staircase, I paused, listening. The house was silent again, the only sound the pounding of my own heart. Had he left? Was he still out there, waiting for me to make a move? I descended the stairs as quietly as I could, my body tense with fear. Each creak of the wooden steps felt like a gunshot in the silence. The basement was just as dark and cold as before, but it felt even more oppressive now, knowing that I was truly trapped. I had no escape. I crouched behind the old workbench once again, my hands trembling. I didn't know how long I could stay hidden. Eventually, he would find me. But what choice did I have? I couldn't fight him. I didn't even know what he wanted. My mind raced with images of the man's mask, the way he had spoken so calmly, as though he knew me, as though this was all just a game. Minutes passed, then an hour. The basement remained silent, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had given up and left. Maybe he had gotten what he came for, or maybe he had moved on to find someone else to torment. But then a new sound shattered the silence. It was faint at first, like the creaking of old wood under pressure, but it grew louder, more persistent. My heart raced as I realized what it was. Footsteps. He was in the house again. I could hear him moving above me, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though he was taking his time, savoring the moment. My stomach churned with fear, and I pressed myself tighter against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear him moving through the kitchen, his boots scraping against the tile floor. He was searching for me. And I knew with a sickening certainty that he wouldn't stop until he found me. The footsteps paused at the top of the basement stairs. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, my body trembling with fear. Was he coming down here again? Was this it? The basement door creaked open. I bit down on my lip, hard enough to draw blood, trying to suppress the whimper that threatened to escape. The darkness felt suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. My muscles ached from crouching in the same position for so long, but I didn't dare move. I could hear him now, moving down the stairs, each step slow and deliberate, just like before. The air in the basement seemed to grow colder with every step he took, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. He was close to close. The footsteps stopped again, and I could hear his breathing slow, steady, and controlled. He was right there, just a few feet away. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I clamped my hand over my mouth, praying he wouldn't find me. For a moment, everything was still. And then, without warning, the beam of a flashlight swept across the basement, cutting through the darkness like a knife. I flinched, pressing myself harder against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. The light passed over the workbench, just inches from where I was hiding, and then moved on. The light moved on, and I exhaled shakily, my body trembling with fear. I didn't know how much longer I could stay hidden. Every second felt like an eternity, and the tension in my muscles was becoming unbearable. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and the sound of metal hitting the floor echoed through the basement. I flinched, my heart racing as I realized he had knocked something over. The sound seemed to startle him too, and for a moment the basement was plunged back into darkness. Then the flashlight beam returned, sweeping over the basement once more. I could hear him moving toward the sound, his footsteps quick and purposeful. He was distracted, at least for the moment, and I knew this was my chance. If I was going to escape, it had to be now. I waited until the beam of light passed over me again, and then, with as much stealth as I could manage, I moved. I crawled along the wall, staying low to the ground, my heart racing with every inch I covered. The darkness was my ally now, and I prayed it would keep me hidden long enough to get out. I reached the far end of the basement, where an old, forgotten door led to the outside. It was rarely used, and I wasn't even sure if it would open. But I had no other choice. My hands fumbled for the handle in the dark, and when I found it, I turned it slowly, praying the door wouldn't creak. It didn't. The door swung open with barely a sound, and a rush of cold night air hit me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the beam of the flashlight sweeping toward me, but the basement remained silent. I slipped out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin as I pulled the door shut behind me. The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but they were my only option. I had to keep moving. I ran. The forest swallowed me up, the branches scratching at my arms and legs as I sprinted through the underbrush. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in my ears, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Behind me, I could hear the basement door creak open again. He was coming. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed myself harder, running faster than I ever had in my life. The trees blurred around me, and the darkness seemed to close in, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. He was gaining on me. My legs ached, and my lungs burned, but I kept running, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, the only thing keeping me going. I broke through the trees and found myself on the edge of the fields, the farmhouse barely visible in the distance. For a moment, I considered turning back, trying to find my way to the road. But then I heard him again, the sound of his boots crunching through the underbrush, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the night. I couldn't go back. I turned and ran toward the fields, the tall grass whipping at my legs as I sprinted through the open space. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision blurred with fear and exhaustion. The farmhouse disappeared behind me, swallowed by the darkness, and I realized that I was truly alone. The footsteps behind me grew louder, and I could hear him now, breathing heavily as he ran. He was close, and then, just when I thought it was over, I tripped. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me as I tumbled into the dirt. Pain shot through my ankle, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to get up, to keep running, but my body wouldn't listen. I lay there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest, as I waited for him to catch up to me. But the footsteps had stopped. The night was silent again. I forced myself to look up, my vision swimming with tears and pain. And there, standing just a few feet away, was the masked man. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, the beam of his flashlight casting long shadows across the field. His mask was expressionless, but I could feel the malice radiating from him. Eventually, I forced myself to stand, hobbling back toward the farmhouse on my injured ankle. The night was eerily silent, and the house stood dark and empty, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I never went back to the farmhouse after that night. I couldn't. The memory of the masked man, his calm voice and his cold, empty eyes, haunted me for years, and sometimes, even now, I still wonder if he's out there, waiting for me to return. Story 2. The Forgotten Highway. The summer of 2011 was one that changed everything for me. My friends and I had planned a road trip to celebrate finishing our last year of college. We were young, eager, and invincible at least. That's what we thought at the time. It was supposed to be a week of adventure, camping under the stars and driving through the vast open roads of America. Little did we know, we would stumble upon something far darker and more terrifying than we ever imagined. There were 5 of us in total. Mike, the self-appointed leader of our group, always full of confidence, and the one who had planned the trip. Jess, his girlfriend, who was just as adventurous as he was. Sarah, my best friend since high school, a little quieter, but with a sharp sense of humor. Greg, the joker of the group, always trying to lighten the mood with his goofy antics. And me, the more reserved one, content to just go along for the ride. We had been on the road for 3 days, driving through deserts, mountains, and small towns that seemed to exist in another time. The trip had been everything we had hoped for: long nights around the campfire, swapping stories and laughing until our sides hurt. But on the 4th day, something changed. We were driving through a particularly remote stretch of desert in New Mexico when Mike suggested we take a detour. "There's this old highway out here," he said, eyes gleaming with excitement. "It's supposed to be totally abandoned. No one drives it anymore. I think it'll be cool to check it out." I wasn't so sure. Abandoned roads in the middle of nowhere never sounded like a good idea, but Mike was persuasive, and everyone else seemed on board. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. The highway wasn't on any of the maps we had, but Mike had found it mentioned in some obscure forum online. It took us about an hour of driving down a bumpy dirt road before we finally found the entrance. A rusty old sign, barely legible, marked the start of Route 58, though most of the letters had faded away with time. The road stretched out in front of us, cracked and overgrown with weeds, leading into the endless desert beyond. "This is it," Mike said, grinning as he pulled the car onto the highway. "We're about to drive into the unknown." At first, the novelty of the abandoned road was exciting. There were no other cars, no signs of civilization, just the open desert and the occasional tumbleweed drifting across the cracked asphalt. We cranked up the music and joked about being the last people on Earth, enjoying the sense of freedom that came with being so completely isolated. But as the hours passed, the excitement began to wear off. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no landmarks, no signs of progress. Just mile after mile of desolation. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, and a sense of unease settled over the group. "We should probably turn back," I suggested after a while, glancing at the gas gauge. We were running low, and the idea of being stranded out here wasn't appealing. "Nah, we've come this far," Mike said, waving off my concerns. "There's bound to be something up ahead. A town or a gas station. We'll be fine." I wasn't convinced, but Mike was determined to keep going, so we pressed on. The road grew rougher as we went, the cracks in the pavement widening, and the weeds growing taller. The desert around us seemed to close in, the horizon distorted by the heat rising from the ground. It felt like we were driving into another world, a place untouched by time and forgotten by everyone. By the time the sun set, we still hadn't seen another car or sign of life. The sky turned a deep shade of purple, and the temperature dropped sharply. We hadn't packed for a night in the desert, and the cold was already seeping through the windows. Greg tried to lighten the mood with one of his usual jokes, but no one laughed. The silence in the car was thick with tension. "I think we should stop," Jess said quietly from the back seat. "We're not going to find anything out here." Mike didn't answer right away, but after a few moments, he sighed and pulled the car to a stop on the side of the road. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the empty highway ahead. We all got out, stretching our legs and trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. "Maybe we should camp here for the night," Sarah suggested. "We've got the gear, and it's better than driving around aimlessly." I wasn't thrilled about the idea of camping on the side of an abandoned highway in the middle of nowhere, but at this point, it seemed like our only option. We set up the tents a little ways off the road, using the car's headlights to see what we were doing. The desert was eerily quiet, with no sounds of animals or wind, just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow everything. As we sat around the small fire we had built, the mood in the group shifted. The excitement of the trip had worn off, replaced by a growing unease. Even Mike, who had been so confident before, seemed on edge. We tried to make small talk, but the conversation quickly died out. No one wanted to admit it, but we all felt the same thing: something was wrong. It was Greg who first brought it up. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" he asked, his voice low. I glanced around at the others, expecting someone to laugh or brush it off, but no one did. Jess hugged her knees to her chest, staring into the fire. Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the log she was sitting on. Even Mike was unusually quiet. "I thought it was just me," Jess murmured, her eyes darting nervously toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "But I've had this feeling since we got on this road. Like there's someone, or something, out there." A chill ran down my spine, and I looked out into the vast expanse of desert surrounding us. The firelight barely reached the edge of the camp, and beyond that was nothing but impenetrable darkness. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just paranoia, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. "We're in the middle of nowhere," Mike said finally, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "There's no one out here but us." He didn't sound convinced, and neither were we. That night, we all slept fitfully, if at all. The temperature had dropped even more, and the cold seeped through our sleeping bags, making it impossible to get comfortable. Every sound, every shift of the wind, seemed amplified in the silence of the desert. I kept waking up, my heart racing, convinced that someone was standing just outside the tent, watching us. But every time I peeked out, there was nothing, just the empty highway and the endless stretch of desert. At some point during the night, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of Jess's scream. I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. The tent was still dark, the air freezing cold. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, Jess screaming, her voice high and panicked. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent, stumbling out into the cold night air. The others were already up, rushing toward Jess and Mike's tent. Jess was standing outside, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. Mike was next to her, trying to calm her down, but he looked just as shaken. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jess pointed toward the road, her hand shaking. There was someone standing right there, just watching us. I followed her gaze, but the road was empty. Nothing but darkness, and the faint outline of the highway stretching off into the distance. "There's no one there," Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. He glanced nervously over his shoulder as he spoke. "I swear I saw someone." Jess insisted, her voice rising. "They were standing right by the road, just watching." We all stood there for a moment, staring out into the darkness, but no one else saw anything. The sense of unease that had been building since we got on the highway had now reached a fever pitch. I could feel it in the air, a heavy, oppressive presence that made it hard to breathe. "We need to get out of here," I said finally, breaking the silence. "This place isn't right. No one argued. We quickly packed up the tents, our hands shaking with cold and fear. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whoever or whatever Jess had seen was still out there, lurking just beyond the firelight. We piled back into the car, Mike at the wheel, and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out before us, dark and empty, as we sped away from the campsite. No one spoke, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. But the further we drove, the worse it got. The road seemed to go on forever, with no end in sight. The gas gauge was nearing empty, and there were still no signs of civilization. Just the endless stretch of cracked pavement and the dark desert beyond. "Where are we?" Greg asked, his voice shaky. "We should have hit something by now, right? A town, a gas station." Anything. Mike didn't answer. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly a.m. We had been driving for hours, but it felt like we were getting nowhere. And then, out of nowhere, the car's headlights flickered. Mike cursed under his breath, slapping the dashboard as if that would fix the problem. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the car's engine sputtering. The car slowed to a stop, the engine cutting out entirely. We sat there in the dark, the silence pressing in on all sides. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind outside and our own shallow breathing. "What do we do now?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. Mike didn't answer. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his face pale and eyes wide with fear, and that's when we saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the faint light of the moon, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, thin limbs and a face obscured by shadow. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, for a moment. None of us could speak. We were frozen in place, trapped by the sight of the figure standing before us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the terror gripping my entire body. Then slowly, the figure raised its arm, pointing directly at us. "Go," Greg shouted, his voice breaking the silence. "We need to go now." Mike fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The figure took a step forward, then another, moving slowly but deliberately toward the car. "Come on," Jess screamed, her voice high with panic. "Mike, get us out of here." The engine sputtered to life, and the headlights flickered back on just as the figure reached the edge of the road. Mike floored the gas pedal, and the car shot forward, the tires screeching against the asphalt as we sped away. No one looked back. We drove for hours, the highway stretching on endlessly, but we never saw the figure again. Eventually, as the sun began to rise, we found our way back to civilization. But none of us were the same after that night. To this day, I don't know what we saw out there on Route 58. I don't know if it was real, or if it was some kind of hallucination brought on by fear and isolation. But one thing is certain, we were not alone on that highway. And sometimes, late at night, I still dream about that figure, standing in the middle of the road, watching, waiting. Story 3. The Haunting of Hollow Creek. The town of Hollow Creek was a place that few people ever visited, and even fewer chose to stay. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was the kind of town that had faded from memory, a relic of a bygone era. The streets were lined with old, dilapidated houses, their once bright paint chipped and faded. The town square, once a bustling hub of activity, was now overgrown with weeds and ivy, the old clock tower looming over it like a forgotten sentinel. Hollow Creek wasn't on any map, at least not anymore. It had been forgotten by the world, and for good reason. I had never heard of Hollow Creek until I stumbled upon it during a road trip through the mountains. I was on my way to visit a friend in a nearby town when my GPS went haywire, leading me off the main road and onto a narrow, winding path through the woods. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The trees closed in around me, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The road itself was cracked and overgrown with weeds, as if it hadn't been used in years. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally spotted a sign at the side of the road. It was old and weathered, the letters barely legible through the layers of dirt and rust. It read, "Welcome to Hollow Creek Population 312. The number had been crossed out, replaced with a hastily scrawled 57. A shiver ran down my spine as I passed the sign, the town coming into view just beyond the bend. It looked like something out of a ghost story, the buildings crumbling, the streets empty. There were no cars, no people, just the wind whistling through the narrow alleyways and the occasional creak of an old wooden door swaying in the breeze. I considered turning around and heading back the way I came, but something about the town drew me in, a morbid curiosity that I couldn't shake. I drove slowly down the main street, my eyes scanning the empty buildings for any sign of life. The windows of the houses were dark, the curtains drawn tightly shut. The only movement came from the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird flitting from one roof to another. I felt a growing sense of unease, but I couldn't turn back now. I had come this far, and I needed to know more. At the center of town stood the old church, its tall, steepled roof casting a long shadow over the square. The church was in better shape than most of the other buildings, its stone walls weathered but intact. A small cemetery lay behind it, the headstones crooked and overgrown with moss. The iron gate that surrounded the graveyard creaked in the wind, the rusted hinges barely holding it in place. I parked the car at the edge of the square, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I took in the scene before me. It felt like the town was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I swallowed hard and stepped out of the car, the soft crunch of gravel under my feet the only sound in the oppressive silence. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the wind had a biting chill to it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. As I walked toward the church, I noticed something strange. There were no animals, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. The town was completely devoid of life, as if the very ground had swallowed it all up. The silence was suffocating, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The church door was slightly ajar, the wood splintered and cracked with age. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, the creak of the hinges echoing through the empty building. The interior was just as dilapidated as the rest of the town. The pews were covered in dust, the altar cracked and crumbling. Stained glass windows lined the walls, but the images had faded over time, leaving only faint impressions of what they once depicted. I made my way down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The silence was oppressive, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones, chilling me to the core. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the shadows. When I reached the altar, I noticed a small, leather-bound book sitting on the edge of the crumbling stone. It was old, the pages yellowed with age, and the cover was cracked and worn. I picked it up, my fingers brushing over the faded lettering on the front, the Chronicles of Hollow Creek. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the book. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and drawings, the ink faded but still legible. As I flipped through the pages, I realized it was a record of the town's history, dating back to the early 1800s. The first few entries were mundane accounts of the town's founding, the construction of the church, the names of the original settlers. But as I read on, the tone of the entries began to change. The later entries spoke of strange occurrences, people disappearing without a trace, livestock found mutilated in the fields, strange lights seen in the sky at night. The handwriting grew more frantic, the words scrawled across the pages as though written in a hurry. One entry, dated 1902, caught my eye. The night was quiet, as it always is in Hollow Creek. But something was different. There was a presence in the air, something dark and malevolent. The townsfolk have been whispering of strange figures seen in the woods at night, and last night, old man Grayson went missing. His house was found empty this morning, the door wide open, and there were no signs of a struggle. They say he was taken by the shadows. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words. I flipped through the pages faster now, the entries growing darker and more ominous with each passing year. By the 1930s, the town had all but fallen into ruin. The population had dwindled, and the remaining residents lived in fear of the shadows, as they called them, dark figures that moved through the woods at night, taking people from their homes, never to be seen again. The last entry was dated 1957. It was short, only a few lines, scrawled hastily across the page. They've come for me. I can hear them outside the door. I don't know if anyone will ever read this. But if you do, leave Hollow Creek. Leave and never return. The town is cursed. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing in my chest. The church felt colder now, the shadows longer and darker than before. I glanced around, half expecting to see one of the dark figures from the book lurking in the corners. But the church was empty. I shoved the book into my bag and hurried toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty church. As I stepped outside, I was hit by a gust of cold wind, and the sky had grown darker, the sun hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The town square was just as empty as before, but something felt different. The air was thicker now, heavier, as though the town itself was closing in around me. I hurried back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. As I finally slid into the driver's seat, I glanced up at the church one last time. That's when I saw them. Figures, dark, shadowy figures standing in the cemetery behind the church. There were 3 of them, tall and thin, their faces obscured by the shadows. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching me. Panic surged through me, and I slammed the car into reverse, backing out of the square as fast as I could. My tires screeched against the pavement as I sped down the narrow road, my heart racing. I didn't dare look back. The road out of Hollow Creek was just as twisted and overgrown as it had been on the way in, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, but I kept my foot on the gas, not slowing down for a second. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the main road. The relief that washed over me was short-lived, however. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the shadowy figures were still there, standing at the edge of the road, watching me. I drove straight to my friend's house, my hands still trembling as I parked in her driveway. I didn't tell her what had happened. How could I? She would never believe me. But I knew the truth. Hollow Creek was cursed, just like the book had said. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see the dark figures standing there, waiting. I stopped going out at night, stopped driving through remote areas. But the fear never really left, and then, one night, I woke up to a soft rustling sound outside my window. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tightly shut, but the sound continued, a faint scratching noise, like branches brushing against the glass. I held my breath, listening. And then, slowly, I got out of bed and walked toward the window. I hesitated for a moment before pulling back the curtain, my hands shaking. Standing just outside the window, barely visible in the darkness, was one of the shadowy figures. Its face was hidden, its body tall and thin, just like the ones I had seen in Hollow Creek. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but when I looked again, it was gone. I haven't been back to Hollow Creek since that day, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I hear the sound of rustling outside my window, and I know they're still out there, watching, waiting. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.